The Nevada desert had a way of humbling everyone who stepped onto it. The air shimmered with heat, and the wind carried fine dust that clung to skin and uniforms like a warning. It was mid-afternoon, the kind of day where the ground looked alive from the mirage. The U.S. Navy SEALs stationed at the Fallon Range were restless, waiting for the newcomer they'd been told would be evaluating their marksmanship performance. None of them liked that phrase. SEALs didn't get evaluated, they evaluated others. Chief Petty Officer Ray Laskin stood with his arms folded, a faint line of sweat running down the side of his neck. He was a large man in his late 30s, broad-shouldered, calm-eyed, and built like he'd been carved from oak. He'd led missions in the Middle East, the Pacific, and Eastern Europe. He wasn't easily impressed. But that changed the moment he saw her. The figure approaching the range was smaller than expected, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. She wore tan fatigues, a standard-issue tactical cap, and carried a long black case that looked heavier than she did. Her name tag read, Kane. H, who's the new guy? Laskin muttered, squinting into the glare. Not a guy, one of the SEALs said, chuckling. That's Harper Kane, civilian consultant, apparently. Heard she's some kind of ballistic specialist. Laskin grunted. A consultant? Out here? Must be someone's experiment from D.C. But as Harper reached the bench, she didn't say a word. She knelt, opened the black case, and began assembling a Barrett M82A11 of the most powerful rifles in the world. Her movements were clean, practiced, and unnervingly calm. She checked the scope alignment, clicked the bipod into position, and ran a gloved finger along the barrel, like a pianist checking keys before a concert. The other SEALs started whispering. Bet she can't even handle the recoil. Probably one of those lab shooters. They know numbers, not field. Yeah, let's see her make a real shot. Laskin didn't speak. He just watched her. There was something in her composure that didn't fit the image of a civilian. Her stance, her posture, the way she breathed, this wasn't someone who spent time behind a desk. Finally, she looked up and asked, "Target distance?" One of the instructors called out, 3247 meters, ma'am. He smirked, as if daring her to even try. Harper adjusted her scope and nodded. Wind? 5 knots, southeast crosswind, the instructor replied. She didn't write anything down. She didn't even look away from the scope. She made a few quick mental calculations, dialed in a slight elevation, and lay prone behind the Barrett. The rifle gleamed under the sunlight, massive, matte black, and perfectly still in her hands. The range went quiet except for the faint whistle of desert wind. A few SEALs leaned forward, expecting her to flinch or hesitate. She didn't. A breath in, a breath out, a finger tightening on the trigger. The shot broke like thunder. The sound echoed across the valley, sharp and deep enough to make a few men flinch. The Barrett kicked back, dust exploding around her as the echo rolled into the hills. For a heartbeat, there was only silence. Then, clang, the faint metallic ping of a steel target carried back across the desert air. Someone blinked. Someone else cursed softly. Did she? No way. That's over 3 clicks. Laskin raised his binoculars, scanned the far range, and saw it a clean, perfect strike dead center on the target plate. She'd hit it. A group of hardened special operators, men who had fought in the most intense conditions on Earth, stood in absolute silence. Harper didn't react. She simply opened the bolt, caught the spent casing midder, and examined it briefly before setting it aside. Then, without a word, she chambered another round. Do it again. One of the younger SEALs muttered under his breath, still half convinced it was luck. Harper heard him. She didn't speak, but her lip twitched in the faintest hint of amusement. She made a tiny adjustment to the windage dial, closed the bolt, and fired again. Another echo rolled out then. A second later, another metallic ping. 2 shots. Same spot. Perfect grouping. Now nobody spoke. Laskin lowered his binoculars and stared at her. He'd heard rumors about a female shooter who'd done the impossible overseas. Classified operation. A 3,200-meter confirmed hit during a rescue mission in the Afghan mountains. The file was never released, the name redacted. It was a story soldiers told in bars, something halfway between myth and legend. And now that legend was standing right in front of him. He took a step forward. "You're the sniper?" he asked quietly, more a statement than a question. Harper didn't answer immediately. She laid the Barrett down on the bench, pulled out a soft cloth, and began wiping the dust from the receiver. Her movements were slow and deliberate, not for show, just habit. "I prefer the term observer," she said finally, not looking up. Laskin frowned. "Observer?" She nodded slightly. "A sniper just pulls a trigger. An observer changes an outcome." For a moment, the words hung in the dry air like smoke. The other SEALs exchanged glances, some confused, some intrigued. Laskin studied her more closely now. She was in her early 30s, maybe younger, but her eyes held the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen too much. Calm, unshakable, dangerous, in the quietest possible way. He tried again. "Who trained you?" She smiled faintly. "Different people. Some didn't survive long enough to finish the lessons." That wasn't bravado. It was fact, spoken like a weather report. Before he could press further, a call came over the radio from the command tent. They wanted Harper debriefed and the range data logged immediately. She stood, slung the Barrett over her shoulder, as if it weighed nothing, and turned toward the tents. As she walked away, Laskin caught the faint scent of gun oil and desert wind. Something about her presence lingered long after she disappeared from view. The SEALs began murmuring again. "Did you see that grouping?" She didn't even use a spotter. She made that look easy. Laskin didn't answer. He just kept staring at the distant target. 2 perfect holes less than an inch apart. He'd seen elite snipers take years to master long-range precision like that. Yet this woman had walked in from nowhere, hit a record-breaking distance twice, and treated it like it was just another drill. As the sun sank lower behind the desert ridge, the wind began to cool. Laskin finally took off his cap, wiped the sweat from his brow, and muttered to himself, "What the hell did the Navy just send me?" Later that night, he pulled her file from the restricted folder. Most of it was blacked out. No listed unit. No base. Just a string of dates, coordinates, and one single line under notable operations. Classified Joint Task Force. Confirmed objective success. And under that, a signature. H. Kane. Laskin leaned back in his chair, staring at the dim screen glow. He didn't know whether to feel honored or uneasy. But one thing was certain. This wasn't just some ballistic expert or civilian consultant. Whoever Harper Kane really was, she'd earned her legend the hard way. And tomorrow, he intended to find out just how far her skills really went. By nightfall, the Fallon base hummed with the low, familiar energy of men and women on standby lights blinking, boots scuffing, radios muttering. Stories flowed easier in the mess hall than in the briefing room, and by the time Laskin pushed open the steel door, the seed of Harper Kane's afternoon had already sprouted into a dozen variations of the same tale. 3247 meters, one junior operator said, dropping a spoon into his bowl for emphasis. He was a fresh transfer, teeth still bright, voice full of the kind of bravado that hadn't yet been tempered by long nights on alert. She hit it twice, dead center. With a Barrett. Over 3 clicks. Another man snorted. Maybe she used laser guidance. Maybe she had a spotter on the ridge. His tone held the contempt of someone who'd watched too many glossy media pieces and not enough fieldcraft. At a corner table, a group of professionals, the range instructors, a couple of intel guys, and a few senior SEALs watched without joining in. Laskin slid into a seat opposite them. His eyes were tired, but focused. "She did it," he said simply. No flourish. No gloating. Just the fact of it. An instructor shoved a tablet across the table toward him. The range had logged the telemetry timestamps, atmospheric readings, the ballistic computer's estimates. Laskin scanned the data, the numbers marching across the screen like soldiers' information. The ballistic solution the computer had proposed didn't match the hits. The human element had outperformed the model. At distance, the instructor said, margin for error is tiny. Extremely tiny. He looked at Laskin as if to say, "We both know what that means." Laskin's jaw tightened. He'd led men into firefights where milliseconds meant survival and bullets decided stories. He understood precision when he saw it. Word spread beyond the mess. Men who'd never shown interest in marksmanship found themselves flushed with curiosity. The comms room had a buzz as junior handlers tried to pull records. The ops officer, a wiry woman named Lieutenant Marquez, finally called Laskin into her office. "You pulled her file?" she asked without preamble. He had. He shoved a printout across her desk. Most of the document was redacted thick black bars, like bands of night across text. There were dates, coordinates, shorthand mission names, and a handful of after-action blurbs. One line read, "Curt and clinical, confirmed shot. Mission effect achieved." Beside it, in plain script, a name. H. Kane. Marquez licked her lip thoughtfully. "We get contractors doing advanced ballistics, sure. But a civilian and a lone one making shots like that in theater? Either she's a prodigy, or she's scratched her way through operations we haven't seen. You think it's lucky?" Laskin asked. No. She tapped the redacted areas with a pen. Lucky doesn't have classified folders. Outside, rain rare for the Nevada high desert began to thread across the sky in a thin, uncertain drizzle. The sound on the metal roof sounded like a typewriter, typing out a prelude to questions no one wanted to ask. Laskin left Marquez's office with a new file request in his pocket. Anything that could corroborate Harper Kane's presence in operational theaters. He knew the bureaucracy requests could be buried under FOIA and needlessly long approvals, but instincts didn't wait. He walked to the barracks where operators caught what sleep they could. He paused outside a bunk where an older SEAL, Calloway, was half awake, cigarette ash long cold in an overflowing tray. "You worked with ghosts," Laskin said conversationally, using the old euphemism for deniability-shrouded operators. Calloway's eyes opened just enough to catch the name. "Ghosts," Calloway echoed. He had the slow, haunted cadence of someone who'd seen panoramas of desert sunrise and rotors dipping into the dust. "There's one that used to run with Task Element Black. Didn't have a name on record. Folks called her the Mechanic because she always left no trace." He tapped his cigarette ash and shrugged. Could be the same. Or could be rumor grew legs. Rumor had that dangerous quality of truth. It was eager to become real. Laskin recognized it. He also recognized the disciplined silence that special operations required. Some stories were true and could not be told without endangering lives. That was part of the job, to hold details like flint, only striking them when necessary. The next morning, the range reopened. Harper was on site again, as if the previous day had been merely an introduction rather than revelation. She moved through the morning with the same quiet industry-checking optics, chatting with technicians about zeroing and lens clarity, answering technical questions with the minimal, almost mechanical politeness of someone who'd learned to limit exposure. A crowd gathered, less out of mockery and more out of curiosity. Laskin walked up beside her as she wiped the Barrett with deliberate, almost reverent strokes. "You okay with all this attention?" he asked. Harper didn't look up. "Attention is a resource. Some people waste it." Then faintly, almost like someone revealing a private map, she added, "I prefer focus." He forced a half-smile. "So tell me, how do you get that much range time? How do you make those shots in the field?" Her hands paused on the cloth. For one breath, something in her posture shifted a micro-expression of distance, as if the mind was moving to another place entirely. "You ever see a storm roll across the Hindu Kush?" she asked softly. Laskin blinked. The answer had come in a way he hadn't expected, metaphor instead of bragging. But it was precise. He'd been in places where weather and terrain taught you lessons faster than any classroom. "There was a mission," Harper continued, voice low. "Convoy got hit. I was called in as an observer, signed in as a contractor, buried in layers of deniability. Enemy had an indirect fire team and a mobile anti-vehicle platform. They'd positioned inside a ravine, hidden by a sandstorm the size of a small city. We had hostages. We had time that was measured in heartbeats, not hours." The mess hall murmured in low appreciation as soldiers leaned in. Harper's voice had drawn them. Someone who could keep a room in silence had authority. "I had one shot window," she said. The computer wanted to predict what the wind would do. It failed because the storm was forming a wall that bent the wind in unexpected eddies. I watched the sand, how it moved over an object, how its shadow shifted. I made a call. I took a shot from a position that, on paper, was madness. She folded her hands and looked at Laskin, eyes unwavering. The bullet traveled. It found the exact space between the launcher and the crew. It detonated the mechanism without endangering the convoy's traction. No footprints leading back to us. Hostages extracted. There was a pause, long enough for the implications to settle. Being an observer, she'd said she'd changed the outcome. That language resonated more than a catalog of confirmed hits. Operators didn't care merely about numbers. They cared about effect, what one action altered in the calculus of survival. Laskin felt a mix of skepticism and admiration. "You have a spotter? How do you visualize the shot?" She smiled, a cold, composed thing. "No spotter. Sometimes you have to be the instrument and the eye." She tapped the Barrett as if it were more confident than the men around them. "And sometimes you have to trust the silence." Later, Laskin would be told that Harper's story only scratched the surface. Her missions were threaded through redacted folders and whispered rumors, rescue extractions, counter-terrorism interdictions, precision shots that arrived at moments that turned operations from disaster to success. She'd been the invisible lever, the fulcrum someone else could pull without anyone seeing the torque. Back at his desk that evening, Laskin stitched together what he could from official logs and grainy after-action reports. There was a confluence, dates, an operation descriptor here, a satellite ping there. Each fragment suggested she'd been in theaters where the stakes were non-negotiable. There were photographs, too, blurred images of a long rifle silhouette at dusk, a muzzle flash caught like a heartbeat, a shadow that might be human. But more than the files and the visuals, there was another truth Laskin felt in his bones. Harper moved like someone who had earned her silence. The peace with which she handled a loaded weapon, no showboating, no eager telling, felt like the armor of someone who'd learned that actions, not words, were the currency of their trade. As days bled into weeks, the chatter around Harper shifted from incredulity to respect. Men who'd scoffed at her presence now deferred, quietly asking technical questions about conditions and adjustments. The range instructors requested her assessments. Junior shooters stayed late to watch her zero. Yet Harper remained enigmatic. She answered what was asked and nothing more, provided data when it would help a mission. and vanished into the background when the lights dimmed. The more Laskin probed official channels, the more he recognized a pattern. A highly skilled operator who existed in operational gray, the kind of person militaries used when plausible deniability was required, and who vanished when the spotlight threatened to warm. One night, alone in the small hours, Laskin stood again on the firing line where, days before, 2 bullets had pinged a steel plate over 3 kilometers away. He ran a hand along the cold metal rail and thought of the quiet woman who'd made it happen. The desert around him was a washed map in moonlight, humble, honest, impatient. He felt something like apprehension and something like opportunity. Whoever Harper Kane was, whether legend or reality, she had entered a part of his life that would not let go. He had a responsibility, now not just to test this skill for show, but to integrate it into the corrosive, urgent work they did. Tomorrow, he decided, he would ask her to come on a mission. Not to prove herself, but because sometimes, in the lonely calculus of operations, one human being's ability to change an outcome was the difference between life and death. For the first time since she'd stepped onto the range, Laskin felt the future shift beneath his hands. The record shot was no longer a headline. It was a resource. And in the business they were in, a resource like that demanded a plan. The rumor lodged in the ranks like a burr, annoying, persistent, impossible to ignore. Harper Kane had knocked the dust off the record books on the Fallon range, and now the base held its breath, splitting stories into small, scrutinizing pieces. Men who'd seen combat swapped details like contraband cigarettes in the rec room. They loved a legend, especially one that walked among them in plain fatigues. A week after the afternoon shot, Laskin's mailbox pinged with an unexpected message. The sender was not on any of his usual contact lists. It read simply, "Call when you can." The message contained no rank, no unit. Laskin frowned. Military email rarely wore such casual signatures. He dialed the number. A voice answered on the third ring, dry, measured, with the gruffness of someone who had fewer figures to spare for pleasantries. "Ray Laskin, who is this?" Laskin asked. He kept his face impassive, though inside he was alert. He'd learned that unvetted calls often meant paperwork, and paperwork could mean trouble. "Calloway gave you my number," the voice said. "Major Adrian Morales. I ran a logistics element with some cross-attachments in Helmand. Heard you've got a woman on the range making people question their models." Laskin let out a short, surprised laugh. "Word travels faster than paperwork." "What do you want, Major?" "Want to talk about ghosts," Morales replied. "About a woman who used to show up where things were about to go very bad and make them go very well, not bad." They set a time. When Laskin arrived at the agreed spot, a neutral cafe off base that tolerated uniforms and quiet conversations, Morales was already there, nursing black coffee like it was a relic. He was in his late 30s, as Laskin, but the lines on his face told different stories. Storms weathered, radios kept silent, people left behind. "You ever hear of the ghost of Kandahar?" Morales asked without preamble. He spoke as one might recite a childhood tale, but his eyes were iron true. "Only in bars," Laskin admitted. "Or in redacted reports." Morales's mouth twitched. "Not a bar, then." There was a convoy, multinational, high-value logistics. Night ambush well executed. The enemy had emplaced an anti-vehicle platform and indirect fire within a fold of the ridge. They were hidden behind a sand wall. Sensors saw movement, but not the team. Command gave the strike package, but the window was too tight for an airstrike without risking civilians. Someone recommended deniability. Someone else recommended an observer with a rifle. Laskin felt the ache of recognition in the details. The kind of missions Morales was describing lived in a different language, one where outcomes mattered more than procedures. You're saying someone made a precision shot through a sandstorm? Morales nodded. Not someone. Harper Kane, or the ghost. Call it what you like. We had people pinned down. Hostiles were about to fire an RPG volley at 3 vehicles, 2 of which had civilians in them. We had maybe 30 seconds before they engaged. They both sat silent for a moment, coffee cooling between them. In the low hum of the cafe, Laskin felt the same thin electric current he'd felt the afternoon of the range, the sense that one mind's calm could bend the impending chaos. How did she find the shot? Laskin asked finally. In a storm like that, sensors lie. Wind whips differently at different elevations. Modeling fails. Morales's eyes narrowed like someone who'd turned over a complicated problem in his head 100 times. She listened, he said simply. You can laugh at the simplicity, but it's the honest truth. Harper moved into a position that everyone told you was useless. She watched the sand, how it piled, how it shadowed, how it curled off the ridge. She watched a single gust shift and used it as a measure. She ran the numbers in her head while the rest of us argued with our radios. Laskin pictured it. A sandstorm sculpting the landscape, hiding men and machines, a small pocket of calm where one person could see the bones of motion. The thought seemed almost too cinematic to be true. And yet Morales's voice didn't carry the tone of a man selling a tale. He sounded like a man who'd been given back something that could have been taken. She took the shot, Morales continued. The bullet hit the launcher between the firing crew and the trigger. It detonated the mechanism, rendered it inoperable. The convoy rolled through. No casualties, no trace left leading back to us. Satellite imagery later showed a single impact. No sign we were there, except that one hole. And she wasn't credited? Laskin asked, incredulous. She was buried under a dozen annexes that said, in different ways, do not discuss. Contractors had to be plausible deniability, remember? Morales's grin was a brief, bitter thing. We all signed non-disclosure agreements thicker than my marriage certificate. It's the way the world works when you do things governments prefer not to own. Laskin's hand curled around his coffee cup until the rim creaked. The moral calculus of special operations had always been bloodless in file language. Collateral mitigated, mission success achieved. But a human life balanced on that decision. The hostages, the civilians in the convoy, gave the words weight. He felt the gravity of it settle like an anchor. Why tell me this now? He asked. Because you're the one watching her, Morales said. Because men who make myths have to be handled. We don't put legends to work without understanding why they can do it and what they cost. You lead a team, Laskin. You should know what's in your garage. There was more in Morales's tone than caution. There was the residue of respect. He'd seen Harper act and knew the consequence. Lives saved, a neat surgical solution that left no fingerprints. He also knew the cost obligations, secrecy, the slow eat of isolation that follows someone who cannot speak about what they have seen or done. Laskin asked, did she stay with you after? For a while, Morales said. She comes and goes. People like her aren't stationary. She moves where she's needed. She hates awards. She hates parades. She wants outcome, not stories. They left the cafe with more than coffee grounds in their cups. Morales's recollections filled in the edges of Harper's silhouette, a woman who could read wind like a book, who preferred the precision of numbers to the theater of accolades, who worked in the unlit corners where policy and necessity crossed swords. Laskin found himself both admiring and unsettled. Operatives like that were effective, but volatile currency. Back at Fallon, he watched Harper from a distance as she inspected gear with a quiet thoroughness. Her face was unreadable, but now it carried a lineage, a history beyond the range. threaded into far landscapes where sandstorms were as common as ghosts. He thought of Morales's words about cost and secrecy, and he realized the record shot was not just an arrow in a ledger. It was a promise and a burden, a fact that could save lives, but also make life complicated in ways that weren't easily filed or dismissed. That evening, Laskin found himself on the firing line again, fingers tracing the cold metal as wind stitched patterns into the sand. He folded his thoughts like a map, looking for places where Harper's skill might fit his team's needs. There were missions that required deniability, rescue extractions that could not risk airstrikes, operations where one bullet, perfectly placed, could change everything. He also thought about the woman himself, someone who did not seek credit, who preferred to be a tool rather than a headline. In their world, tools were scarce and expensive, and sometimes you had to decide whether to use them and how. The decision would not be his alone. It would involve commanders and legal pads and men in rooms who argued in euphemism and redaction. But for now, Harper remained in the peripheral, her legend swelling among the ranks. Men spoke of the ghost of Kandahar like a figure from folklore. But Laskin, who had been watching carefully, knew the truth. She was a person who had been sharpened by fire and secrecy. And like any finely honed thing, she needed handling with care. He made a quiet vow to learn not just what she could do, but what she carried. The best weapons weren't just tools. They were people, and the people who could bend outcomes without spectacle often carried weight that no one else could see. If he was going to call on that weight, he owed it to his team to understand the cost. As darkness settled, the desert exhaled. Laskin looked out over the range, imagining a far-off ridge where wind and sand still remembered the strike, and he wondered how many lives had been saved by bullets no one would ever learn about. The legend kept walking, and now, with Morales's confirmation, it carried a name: Harper Kane. When dawn rose over Fallon, the base looked like it always did, steel-gray hangars gleaming faintly in the morning haze, the distant sound of jets breaking the quiet, and soldiers moving in precise, rehearsed rhythm. Yet that morning, something unseen stirred beneath the routine. Commander Ray Laskin had received a sealed communiqué marked Operational Priority, Eyes Only. It was rare for his unit to receive anything classified at that level without prior notice. And the name attached made his pulse slow: Rear Admiral Trent Calloway. Calloway didn't hand out assignments lightly. He was the kind of leader who had seen more wars than paperwork and could read a soldier's soul by the way they stood at attention. If he was sending something directly to Laskin, it meant trouble, the kind that didn't make it to press briefings. Laskin broke the seal and unfolded the single-page order. The content was brief but surgical. Operation Severn, observation and neutralization support requested. Target: high-value insurgent leader, codename Azan. Theater: northern Afghanistan, unconfirmed mountainous region near Balamer Ghab. Duration: undetermined. Personnel requested: Tier 1 SEAL element plus long-range sniper, civilian authorization attached. Command oversight: Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC. He froze on the last line of the document. Civilian authorization attached. There was only one civilian under his command umbrella capable of fitting that description: Harper Kane. Later that morning, Harper was already at the range, methodically cleaning her Barrett M82A1. She moved with quiet precision, stripping the weapon like she'd been born with it. Each click, each pass of the oilcloth seemed ritualistic. The rifle wasn't a tool to her. It was an extension of her breath, a living machine that reflected her discipline. Laskin approached her without a word, stopping a few feet away. She didn't look up. She had that habit, knowing when someone was near without ever showing surprise. "You've been requested," he said after a moment. Harper paused mid-motion, a cleaning rod halfway through the barrel. Requested or summoned? Laskin smirked faintly. I'm not sure there's a difference anymore. She finally looked up, her hazel eyes calm but assessing. Where? Afghanistan, Laskin replied. Mountains near Bala Murghab. JSOC wants a recon and potential elimination mission. Target code-named Azin. They asked specifically for the shooter capable of confirmed 3,000-meter precision. The corner of Harper's mouth tugged. Just slightly, not amusement, but irony. They make it sound like a trick shot. You're not obligated, Laskin said. This isn't a base test or a contract demo. This one's real, the kind that doesn't end with applause. Harper nodded slowly, her gaze dropping back to the rifle. I don't do applause, Commander. That much Laskin already knew. The pre-deployment briefing was held that afternoon inside a secure room lined with screens and maps. Only 5 people attended: Laskin, Harper, 2 of his senior SEAL operators, and an intelligence liaison from JSOC. The liaison, a pale man named Nolan, clicked a remote, and a map of northern Afghanistan blinked to life. Satellite imagery revealed jagged ridges, rivers winding like scars, and clusters of mud brick villages scattered across barren terrain. Target Azin has resurfaced, Nolan began. We've confirmed through human and drone feeds that he's operating from a fortified cave complex above 2,000 meters. He's responsible for multiple attacks on coalition convoys. Our last drone strike attempt was jammed. Whoever's backing him has tech and discipline. He switched slides to grainy photos of heavily armed fighters, a convoy of black pickup trucks, and a thermal outline of the mountain stronghold. We can't risk a full assault. Too many civilians nearby, too much visibility. We need an observer, someone who can locate the leader, confirm visual, and, if authorized, take the shot. Nolan's gaze shifted toward Harper. You'll be embedded with Commander Laskin's team? She didn't react outwardly, but Laskin caught the slight tightening of her jaw. She hated bureaucratic phrasing, if authorized. She didn't need authorization to breathe or act when lives were on the line. He intervened smoothly. What's our insertion plan? Nolan clicked to the next slide, a topographic render. You'll go in under cover of darkness. Air insertion from Bagram. Landing zone is here, 1 kilometer southeast of the objective. You'll establish a high observation post and wait for signal verification. Once Azin's presence is confirmed, Kane provides overwatch. Extraction window is 12 hours max. Harper asked, wind projections? Unstable, Nolan admitted. That's why they need someone who can read more than weather reports. She gave no acknowledgement, but her eyes lingered on the mountain outline. To her, it wasn't just terrain, it was a math problem. One that involved wind shear, elevation drop, temperature gradient, and time of flight variables that most shooters wouldn't attempt to solve without a computer. She'd learned long ago that the wind had its own language, and she was fluent in it. 2 nights later, the C-130 transport droned low over the Afghan desert, its red interior lights washing faces in a muted glow. The SEALs sat in silence, checking gear, lost in their own thoughts. The hum of the engines was steady, almost hypnotic. Harper sat opposite Laskin, running final diagnostics on her Barrett. She handled the weapon with the reverence of a surgeon, prepping for an operation. Every component was familiar: barrel, bipod, optic, trigger pull, magazine feed. Yet before every mission, she still performed the same ritual, as if repetition itself could tame fate. Laskin watched her, quietly impressed. You always that calm before a jump? She didn't look up. I'm not calm. I'm focused. He nodded, appreciating the difference. Most people can't tell the two apart. She gave a faint, knowing smile. Most people don't have to shoot through a mile of air. The red light over the ramp flicked to amber, 1 minute to jump. Laskin gave his final orders. Stay tight. Silent insert. Kane, you're on my 6 until we reach the ridge. No comms until set up. Once in position, you own the mountain. Copy, Harper replied simply. The rear ramp yawned open, and the roar of cold night air filled the cabin. Below, Afghanistan stretched into endless shadow, an ocean of rock and silence. One by one, the SEALs dropped into the void. Harper was last. As she stepped off the ramp, the earth seemed to swallow her whole. They landed without incident, their parachutes folding silently into the dust. The night air was thin and dry, carrying the faint scent of cedar and stone. The team moved quickly through the darkness, using the terrain for cover. Harper's movements were efficient, almost eerie in their control. She carried nearly 70 pounds of gear, rifle, optics, thermal imager, water, and backup rounds, yet her pace never faltered. She didn't waste a step. When they reached the ridge, she set up immediately. Her rifle came alive in her hands, bipod extended, suppressor fixed, scope calibrated. She made minute adjustments, listening to the wind shift around the rocks. Laskin crouched beside her, scanning the valley below through binoculars. Tiny specks of light flickered near the cave entrance, sentries. He whispered, "We're here." Harper didn't respond. Her attention was locked through the scope, her breath steady. She began measuring distance, angle, drift, velocity. To anyone else, it was numbers. To her, it was poetry. After 20 minutes, she murmured, "Target movement. 3 armed. 1 central, different gate, heavier. Might be Azin." Laskin leaned closer. "You sure?" "Not yet," she said. "I don't miss, but I don't guess either." For the next hour, they waited. The temperature dropped, wind rising like an invisible tide. Harper stayed unmoving, her eyes never leaving the glass. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger, patient, coiled, ready. Then, through the scope, a new figure appeared, surrounded by guards, issuing orders. The pattern of movement matched the satellite footage perfectly. It was him. Harper exhaled, a slow, deliberate breath that felt like the world pausing. Her voice, barely a whisper. "Target confirmed." Laskin nodded, signaling the relay. Within seconds, command authorization came through the encrypted channel. Green light, execute. Harper adjusted for the wind. 1/4 left drift, 12 miles per hour, gusts at 10 degrees. She knew the math without thinking. Then she let the crosshair settle just beneath the target's collarbone. The trigger broke like glass. The rifle whispered once, and the world below changed forever. The shot traveled farther than anyone on the ridge could have felt. Below, the compound convulsed into chaos, the exact surgical kind the planners had promised, but rarely achieved. The team held their breath as thermal outlines scattered and radio chatter spiked into brief, panicked bursts. Then silence, like the afternote of an orchestra. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the radios lit with the clipped voice of the assault element inside the objective. Target down. Objective secure. Hostages extracted. Laskin let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, and felt an immediate wash of relief, followed by the cold clarity of work unfinished, extraction, movement, and the accounting of human cost. They exfiltrated under cover of the waning night, slipping along goat tracks that sank into the mountain like secret promises. The team moved fast and efficient, but it was Harper's hands that never stopped checking the Barrett, re-zeroing in case they had to shoot again, folding the weapon with the same care she'd shown in Fallon. She refused to let the rifle rest in her pack. It was too much like leaving a part of herself behind. At the forward operating base, the mood shifted into after-action mode. There were protocols to follow, medical checks, satellite uplinks, formal reports, and then the quieter, more ambiguous rituals. Interrogations constrained by rules of engagement, damage assessments, and the inevitable debrief. The JSOC liaison wanted a detailed account, down to the wind shear and the minute of flight time. Laskin prepared to speak to cameras and analysts who would only ever see sanitized slides and coded language. Harper moved through the debrief like an instrument, present, precise, and economical with words. She answered technical questions in numbers and vectors, told them what she'd seen in the scope, and the small corrections she'd made for altitude and temperature. The analyst scribbled, eyes bright at data that might refine models and improve future mission planning. But as the formal questions concluded, the room's tone shifted. There were human inquiries now, the sort that asked for a face behind a number. A young lieutenant, inexperienced and still raw from the adrenaline of being near action, asked, "How do you do it? How do you pick the moment?" Harper's answer was simple but strangely revealing. "You look for where the world is about to make a mistake," she said, "and you put your bullet where that mistake will make the least damage. It's not glamour. It's math and timing and empathy for people you've never met." Her voice was flat, almost tired, but the words landed like a steady hand. That idea, empathy as calculation, rippled through the room. Operators were trained to value effect over spotlight, but few spoke of compassion as part of lethality. Laskin watched the faces of his people, reading the change. Respect deepened into something like understanding. The briefing became less about numbers and more about responsibility. By daylight, the public narrative had already been constrained. JSOC's release to coalition partners was a paragraph laced with euphemism. Precision action resulted in neutralization of high-value threat. Collateral casualties minimized. No names. No details. No acknowledgement of the human calculus behind the decision. The files would be redacted, the cameras kept at bay, the story compressed into digestible bureaucracy. In private, however, consequences branched outward like the splinters of a struck board. The insurgent network frayed, communication scrambled, and other cells moved more cautiously. Intelligence reported a cascade of arrests and defections over the following days. People who had been waiting for a sign that their cause could or could not hold. The mission had effects that weren't plotted on a single slide, ripple effects on morale. Supply lines and the calculus of power in a region worn thin by conflict. Laskin found himself pulled into meetings where sanctions and legal language were debated over long, stale coffee. Men in suits argued the merits of deniability versus the moral burden of secrecy. Harper refused these conversations. She had no taste for committee rooms. She preferred to be where the work was done, in the quiet between breaths, where decisions cut cleanly and consequences were immediate and visible. But she understood the politics. She had learned that operational success rarely meant public vindication. That evening, in a dim tent with a single lantern, Laskin asked the question that tugged at him since the flight over. "How do you handle it?" He asked, "The secrecy. The ghosts." Harper's face was a study in small gestures, tight jaw, eyes narrowed against a memory. She didn't answer at first. Then, with the simplicity of someone who had long ago stopped making excuses, she said, "I don't tell people. I don't sleep well, but I sleep enough to do the next job." She tapped the barrel of the Barrett with a finger, not touching metal, but touching the idea of continuity. You learn to let the fact of things be enough. Recognition is a distraction. It complicates the ledger. Laskin understood the ledger metaphor. As a commander, he'd been the author of many such tallies: men saved, men lost, collateral minimized. There was a weight to being responsible for others' lives that paperwork could not settle. He appreciated Harper's humility, But he also saw the danger. People who carried burdens alone risked breaking silently. Over the next days, the team filtered back into routine maintenance checks, weapons cleaning, logistics. But a low, persistent hum followed them. The knowledge that a precise action had altered more than a single equation. Harper's presence altered interpersonal dynamics too. Men who had once mocked the idea of a civilian shooter now sought her advice on ballistic solutions and personal coping strategies. She answered technical questions readily, personal ones rarely. The mission's aftermath also brought new scrutiny. Higher headquarters requested an after-action package that included all telemetry, audio logs, and witness statements. Legal asked for an assessment of rules of engagement. Analysts wanted to understand exactly how a shot had been made through wind shears that usually made such attempts a gamble. Every request pulled the operation into a lattice of oversight that made some uncomfortable. Harper, for her part, was practical. She provided the data, but refused to be the narrative centerpiece. She declined public commendations. When an administrative officer suggested a commendation packet, she said flatly, "Don't. You'll make it public. And then I'll be a problem." The deputy commander, a man with years of theater experience, argued softly for recognition as a morale factor giving troops a story they could rally behind. Harper interrupted him with a small, firm line. "Stories get people killed sometimes." It wasn't a threat. It was a reality. The kinds of missions she'd done lived in a gray area where applause could become an intelligence trail. Names in a paper could be traced, timelines compared, patterns discerned. Denial and ambiguity were shields. Recognition was exposure. Still, Laskin felt the human pull to protect his team's morale and to honor bravery in a form the unit could see. So he did what he could in the margins, quiet, meaningful gestures. He requested that the team receive a group commendation for the operation, one that honored collective action rather than individual glory. It passed through channels with asterisks and euphemisms, but the men on the ground understood. They raised a glass in the mess that night for comradeship, for the precision that saved lives, and for the silent woman who had cleaned her rifle under the desert sun and then changed the course of people's lives. A week later, intelligence updated the region's status. Supply routes disrupted, leadership hierarchy in disarray, a temporary lull in major offensives. The effect was measurable, but so was the cost. Harper's movements were monitored more closely in some quarters, and whisper networks of adversaries circulated rumors and photos. Operational security tightened. Harper's anonymity became more fragile. The fragility was not just tactical. It was personal. In the quiet hours, Harper's gestures revealed a heaviness. She was efficient and direct in the field, but between missions she drifted, reading lightweight technical manuals or forcing small, private routines like a man who practices the same step to stay upright. Laskin watched her sometimes, thinking of how war could calcify people, how they could become useful instruments that, if not tended, snapped. One night, after the team's group debrief, Laskin found himself standing at the edge of the compound, looking out at a sky full of indifferent stars. Harper appeared beside him without sound, a silhouette against the moonlight. For a long moment, they did not speak. Then she said quietly, "Do you ever think about what comes after this? After the missions stop?" He considered that imagining a life of ordinariness, civilian rhythms, coffee shops, and taxes. Sometimes, he admitted, but duty tends to prefer the present. He turned to her. "You ever want more than this?" She looked out over the ridge, where, not long ago, a bullet had passed through time and changed it. "Sometimes," she said, "but then I think about the people who don't get a second chance. Someone has to be willing to make the difficult call." Her voice had no accusation, only a tired recognition. Laskin nodded. He knew then that Harper's life was bound not by orders alone, but by a moral ledger that calculated in lives saved and lives given. She chose to be the instrument in moments others could not bear. He respected that. He also knew that operators needed care, and not just direction. Someone to notice when the ledger's numbers became too heavy for one person to carry. The mission's paperwork would continue. The commendations would be parsed and perhaps minimized, and the public would never know the exact vector of a single bullet that saved dozens. But inside the unit, where people lived side by side and shared the small rituals of laundry and coffee, the effect was real. A woman named Harper King had altered the course of a convoy and the lives tied to it. For those who'd watched her work her calm into the thunder of a Barrett .50, the record shot was not a headline but a hinge. And for Laskin, the mission had clarified something else. He would not let the ledger crush the person carrying it. If Harper was to keep doing what she did, he would find a way to share the weight. It was a quiet promise, one made without ceremony, but in their business, quiet promises mattered more than medals. Snow had a way of erasing the world. Its soft edges muted sounds, and created a kind of honest geometry. White plains interrupted by black rock, breath hanging visible in front of faces. The team had expected cold, but nothing quite prepared them for the particular stillness of that ridge. The way silence made every small noise matter. The way frozen air altered the song of a bullet. The insertion had been surgical. Helicopters dropped them onto a narrow shelf of rock with a slope, fell sharply into a valley dotted with leafless trees and a compound of corrugated metal sheds. The mission brief had been minimal hostages held inside a fortified warehouse, hostile element rotating in shifts, a high-value systems operator among them. No collateral room for error. No airstrike window. The only reasonable path was patient, methodical observation and a single, irrevocable decision to take the shot at the precise moment that would save lives. Harper moved like someone whose muscles remembered cold before her skin did. Her gear was optimized for low temperatures, batteries insulated, lubricants chosen for viscosity at sub-zero, optics purged of moisture. She worked with a care that bordered on reverence. The Barrett sat on its bipod like a sentinel. She crawled into position behind it, the cloth under her cheek already damp with her breath, her exhale fogging the scope until she steadied herself long enough to see. Laskin and two other SEALs established a perimeter in positions that afforded them cover and quick egress. Their radios were dark, except for essential pings. Night vision silhouettes glowed faintly in the valley below, the enemy forming the crude lattice of pattern and routine that only experience could map. The hostages moved periodically within the warehouse interior, their presence a brittle contract that tied every decision to a moral geometry no algorithm could fully measure. Time stretched. Hours became a patient metronome. Harper checked ballistic tables and adjusted for altitude. Cold air was denser. Pellets of ice and humidity changed drag coefficients. Elevation trimmed velocity. She used a handheld meteorological sensor, watching numbers scroll until they steadied. Wind was treacherous on that ridge. Gusts would funnel through rocky seams, shifting unpredictably. Her notes were small and fast, scribbled in shorthand no one else used. The technology fed numbers, but Harper read the slope of shadows. The way snow blew over a stone outcrop, the invisible sine waves of temperature differentials. She translated those into tiny dials and clicks, into minute adjustments that would change the arc of a bullet over 1,000 meters. At dawn, a pale wash of light rolled over the compound. Figures moved with morning routine, guards stretching, a small team lighting a brazier, a lanky man likely the target approaching a narrow doorway to inspect supplies. Harper's breath slowed. Her eye in the scope found the pattern in his gait, slight favoring of the left foot, a limp from an old wound that matched intel. He moved with confidence that came from assuming safety. It was the wrong assumption. Her gloved finger rested on the trigger, not yet committing. The SEAL beside her checked his watch and whispered, "Now?" The signal would come not as permission, but as a confirmation. The moment when a single action would ripple through the compound in a way that allowed the assault element to move without stirring the hostages. Harper's answer was a small, almost invisible shake of her head. The profile was wrong. Someone else had stepped into the line of sight. She did not shoot. Every aborted opportunity tightened nerves. The team's discipline was under strain. Tension had a temperature. Laskin moved quietly among them, a presence of experience who understood the calculus. Sometimes patience was the deadliest weapon. Sometimes hesitation spared lives. He kept his face neutral, but his eyes betrayed where. Each second that passed made the eventual decision heavier. An hour later, the target left the doorway and went to inspect a stack of crates. He was exposed in the open for a slower step, but not yet with the clear line Harper needed. The weather shifted. A gust funneled through the valley, carrying with it a brief turbulence that would have deflected a bullet at that distance. Harper waited. She listened to the wind. She watched the crates. She read nothing in the numbers that made the call clean. Then, a child's muffled cry, unexpected, unaccounted for, in the dry maps of the mission rose from deep within the warehouse. It was human and raw and decisive in its effect. The insurgent guards froze, heads turned, voices rose. Someone in the compound entered the courtyard to see what had happened. The target stepped into the threshold to peer inside, his guards momentarily distracted by searching for the origin of the cry. The opening was imperfect, short, messy, but it was honest. Harper adjusted for drift, for temperature lapse, for the slight deflection that ice could cause, and then settled the crosshair where it would do the least harm and the most good. A small pressure point at the base of the skull, the instant that would incapacitate without unnecessary fragmentation. It was geometry and empathy blended. She had rehearsed this calculus in a dozen theaters and had lived with the knowledge that bullets had different manners of kindness. Her breath slowed further, the world contracting to the breath that passed through her chest and the small rectangle of light through the scope. The trigger broke. The rifle exhaled. The noise was a piece of the world falling apart in a contained way. Below, chaos erupted as bodies crumpled and men shouted. But the reaction was exactly as planned, violent enough to give cover, but surgical enough to protect the hostages. The assault team surged, silent as wolves, already threading gaps that threatened to close if the response went wrong. In minutes, the compound was overrun. The hostages were found huddled and terrified, but alive, bound with ropes that had not yet torn skin. Their rescue had been bought with precision, not heroics. That made the victory quieter and more complete than any parade. When the dust settled and the team accounted for everyone, Harper exhaled as if she'd been holding her breath for an eternity. Her cheeks were pale, and her hands, always steady, trembled only slightly as she cleared the rifle and eased it into its case. Laskin watched her from the doorway of the warehouse, ash of the smoke on his lips. There was relief in his posture and a deepening care. The work was done, but the aftermath required tending. They moved through the compound, freeing hostages and checking for secondary threats. In a small storage closet, they found letters and photographs, evidence of lives interrupted. A child's drawing tucked in a tin. The sight of such fragile artifacts in the aftermath of violence had an effect on everyone. Men who had been machines folded into humans, who could stand with sorrow and gratitude. Harper's expression remained the same, composed, but with an almost imperceptible softening at the corners of her eyes. Back on the ridge, they set a defensive perimeter and waited for extraction. The terrain had become less cruel in daylight. Snow reflected noonlight so bright it was almost painful. and radio chatter hummed with the distant music of logistics. Aircraft inbound, routes cleared, timelines shifting adroitly. The hostages were secured in a vehicle that would take them to a nearby coalition facility for processing and medical care. Harper checked the scope one last time and closed the lens with a soft click. "Good work," Laskin said quietly when he approached her. He meant it in the way a commander meant it, not as a compliment, but as acknowledgement of a life preserved. Harper nodded, and for a moment she allowed herself to look exhausted, an admission she often denied. "You didn't say much on the wire," one of the younger SEALs offered as they shared water and ration bars. It wasn't a critique, only curiosity. "Did you doubt?" Harper sipped water slowly, the liquid warming her throat. "Doubt is operational," she said. "You doubt the tool, you check it. You doubt the angle, you calculate. You doubt the cost, you weigh it. Killing without calculation is reckless. Slowness without reason is cowardice. You balance or you fail." The language was austere but true. It translated in everyone's minds to the brutal arithmetic of their job. Laskin watched the men digest her answer. Respect pooled in the group like shadow. They had watched someone make a moment into a saving act and then return to tasks as if nothing had happened. That calm was what made her terrifyingly effective. On the flight back to base, the world below was a ribbon of gray and white, mountains like the spine of an old beast. Harper sat quietly, the rifle case at her feet, hands folded. A medic checked the hostage's vitals and mentioned, softly, how one woman had clung to the soldier who cut her ropes, whispering broken thanks. Harper listened, and there was no fanfare, only the recognition that lives had been altered in ways that would resonate for years. That night, in the privacy of a tent, Harper cleaned the Barrett once more. The ritual was necessary, a way to attend to the machine and to herself. Each stroke of the cloth was a small liturgy that acknowledged the violence it had delivered and the lives it had touched. Laskin paused by the tent flap and watched her, feeling a protective instinct he'd have sworn didn't belong to him. He realized then that the tools they used bound them to responsibilities that were not easily shed. As sleep came, if it came, Harper thought of the faces she had just seen freed from ropes, and of the weight of choices that allowed such moments. The cold that had stung their skin all day settled into the bones, and in that thin quiet she allowed herself a single admission. She was tired, not of the job, but of carrying the ledger of outcomes alone. The ridge had been quiet, the shot had been precise, and the world had, for a moment, tilted back toward the people who needed it. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and the mountain kept its secrets. Inside, among men who would tidy weapons and lie awake, a woman polished a rifle and tried, as best as she could, to make peace with the cost of doing what needed to be done. The base at Coronado was alive with noise rotors thumping overhead, waves breaking in rhythm beyond the wire, and the familiar echo of boots on concrete. But within the training compound where Harper returned, the noise seemed to fade the moment she stepped through the door. She had been gone for months on a mission that didn't officially exist, and in her absence, stories had grown rumors whispered in the mess hall, speculation traded between platoons. They said a sniper had made a 3,247-meter shot under freezing crosswinds, a shot that defied math and confirmed legends. They said she did it with a calm that scared even veterans. Now, back under the sodium lights of California, she looked more like a ghost than a hero. Her skin was pale, eyes ringed with fatigue, hair pulled back in a way that made her seem both younger and older than she was. The Barrett case followed her everywhere, like a shadow she could not set down. When she walked across the tarmac, heads turned. Men who had been loud a moment before fell quiet, not out of condescension, but from the kind of respect that borders on disbelief. Commander Laskin met her near the hangar. He was different. too, his beard now flecked with more gray than before, his shoulders drawn by months of operational stress. He handed her a sealed envelope. "They want your statement," he said, "for after-action review." Harper gave a small nod. She knew the drill. After every classified engagement, paperwork replaced adrenaline. She was good at details, the times, distances, wind shifts, coordinates. But this report would demand something harder: justification. Every pull of the trigger required context. Every outcome needed defense. The bureaucracy had its own precision. Inside her quarters, she set down the case and opened it. The Barrett gleamed faintly under artificial light. She ran a hand along the cold metal, tracing the faint wear on the receiver where her glove had rubbed during deployment. It was not nostalgia. It was acknowledgement. The rifle had become a part of her story, neither friend nor foe, just truth in steel. Later that afternoon, she sat across from a table of officers, each with a stack of papers and guarded expressions. A digital recorder blinked red between them. "Sergeant Harper," the senior officer began, "your actions resulted in the neutralization of the primary hostile, and contributed directly to the rescue of 11 hostages. Confirm?" "Yes, sir," Harper replied evenly. He adjusted his glasses. "Intel confirms a distance of 3,247 meters from point of engagement. That's," he paused, glancing at his peers, "a record shot. Can you walk us through your decision process?" She did, step by step. The preparation, the atmospheric conditions, the holdover correction, the ethical hesitation before committing. She described wind as if it were a living creature, cold as something that could wound judgment. Her tone was clinical, her recollection flawless. The room remained silent for long stretches, not from disinterest, but awe. When she finished, the officer leaned back. "You understand the political significance of what you did?" Harper hesitated. "Sir, I understand that 11 people are alive." The officer's lips pressed thinly. "That's not all. Footage of the rescue leaked through local contacts. Your name wasn't attached, but word spreads. The Pentagon's considering public acknowledgement. They think a face like yours," he stopped himself, aware of how that sounded, "could be useful for recruitment." Harper's eyes flicked upward, sharp but controlled. "With respect, sir, I'm not a mascot." Laskin, who had been silent in the corner, spoke finally. "She's right. She's a soldier, not a slogan." The exchange ended there, but the decision wasn't really theirs. 2 weeks later, Harper's story began to circulate quietly through the military press. A sanitized version, stripped of classified details, but not of wonder. "Unnamed female sniper saves hostages at record range." That was the headline. Within days, it leaked to mainstream media. They called her the Ghost of Cooner. Reporters camped outside the base. Camera crews angled lenses at every female Marine or SEAL walking past, hoping one might be her. Harper ignored the noise, sticking to routine: dawn runs, weapons maintenance, and evening drills with recruits. But she could feel the shift in atmosphere. Soldiers she had once trained beside now greeted her with an awkward mix of admiration and distance. They wanted to thank her, but didn't know how to speak to someone whose legend had already started to outgrow her. The Navy eventually called her to D.C. for a private commendation ceremony. The room was small, lined with flags, the kind of setting designed to project dignity without spectacle. A handful of senior officers attended, along with a secretary from the Department of Defense. The medal, a discreet silver star, was pinned to her chest with rehearsed solemnity. Cameras were prohibited, but Harper knew that didn't mean much. After the ceremony, the secretary approached her personally. "You've done your country proud," he said, his handshake firm but political. "We could use your expertise in the training program, and perhaps in future briefings." "Understood, sir," she replied. But as she left the building, the marble floors echoing beneath her boots, she felt no triumph. Recognition, she realized, was another kind of mission, one where survival meant protecting the self from being turned into a story. Back at Coronado, she resumed duty quietly, mentoring younger shooters. Many came eager, full of swagger and ambition. Harper watched them fire from prone positions, adjusting scopes, correcting posture, teaching them that wind wasn't an enemy, it was information. She spoke little, but every word carried weight. One afternoon, during a long-range training session, a young sniper candidate named Evans approached her. "Ma'am, they say you made the shot without spotter confirmation. Is that true?" Harper considered her answer. "The wind doesn't wait for confirmation," she said softly. "Sometimes you either trust your read or you don't fire." Evans nodded, unsure if it was wisdom or warning. Harper gave a faint smile. "The secret isn't the distance. It's knowing why you're pulling the trigger." That night, Harper sat by the docks alone, the sea breeze cutting cold and familiar. Laskin found her there, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He sat beside her without words for a long while. "They're still talking about you," he said finally. "They'll move on," she replied. "They always do." He studied her profile in the moonlight. "You saved 11 lives. That's not something people should forget." "I didn't do it to be remembered," Harper said. "I did it so those people could." Laskin smiled faintly, understanding more than he said. "You know, when I first saw you clean at Barrett after deployment, I thought you were trying to erase the mission from it." She looked down at her hands. "No," she said quietly. "I was trying to respect it. A rifle's like a story. It holds everything you put through it. You can't pretend it didn't happen. You can only make sure it's clean before you carry it again." The two sat in silence as the night deepened, the waves echoing faintly against the pylons. Somewhere beyond the horizon, new missions were already being planned. Somewhere, another soldier would soon be asked to make an impossible shot. But for now, Harper allowed herself stillness, a kind of peace earned, not given. She knew that recognition was temporary, but discipline was eternal. Tomorrow, she would wake before sunrise, oil her rifle, and train like nothing extraordinary had ever happened. Because in her world, true mastery wasn't about the one shot that made history. It was about every unseen moment that made that shot possible. And though the world might never know her name, within the quiet halls of the SEAL compound, there was a different kind of legend whispered, that of a sniper who carried the weight of her choices with grace, and who taught everyone around her that silence, when filled with purpose, could be louder than any applause. Morning at the range began before the sun broke the horizon. The air smelled faintly of oil, sand, and salt carried from the Pacific. Rows of targets shimmered in the distance, still blurred by mist. Harper stood at her usual spot, the Barrett case at her feet, coffee cooling beside her boot. To anyone passing by, she looked like any other instructor, preparing for another day's training, but those who knew her understood that every session was something more. It was ritual, a way to keep the ghosts quiet. Months had passed since the mission that changed everything. The world had mostly moved on, as she predicted. The news cycle had shifted to other conflicts, other faces, other heroes. But within the quiet halls of the Naval Special Warfare compound, Harper's story lingered not in the headlines, but in the murmurs of rookies repeating her lessons. "Read the wind like it's speaking to you," they'd say. Or, "Precision is patience under pressure." She never claimed those phrases. But they lived on, passed from one generation of snipers to the next like scripture. Laskin approached her from behind, his steps measured and heavy. He carried a clipboard tucked under one arm and a faint smile that didn't quite hide fatigue. "They're sending us to Quantico next week," he said. Joint marksmanship exchange. Marines want you to lecture on ballistic ethics. Harper gave a dry laugh. Ballistic ethics? That's a new one. He shrugged. Their term, not mine. Guess they finally realized a clean shot's more than math. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she assembled the Barrett piece by piece, her hands steady as always. The sound of metal meeting metal was almost meditative. You think they'll listen? She asked finally. Maybe not the way you want, Laskin replied, but they'll remember. The first students arrived shortly after young, eager, faces sunburned from weeks in field training. Most had heard the stories. Some stared at Harper like she was myth. She ignored the awe, focused instead on fundamentals: breathing, angle, environmental compensation. She had no interest in being a celebrity. She wanted competence, precision, responsibility. Anyone can pull a trigger, she told them, her voice cutting clean through the wind. But the moment before you do, that's the part that matters. That's when you decide what kind of person you are. The trainees nodded, scribbling in notebooks. One, a young woman named Ruiz, hesitated before asking, "Ma'am, is it true you made the longest confirmed shot in the field?" Harper paused, eyes narrowing slightly. "Numbers don't matter," she said finally. "Distance isn't what saves lives, judgment does." But later, when Ruiz fired a clean grouping at 900 meters, Harper gave a single approving nod. "Good. Now do it tired, cold, and when everything's gone wrong. That's when you find out who you really are." That evening, as the range emptied and the last echoes faded into the surf, Harper found herself sitting alone again, her solitude a companion she had come to accept. She looked toward the horizon, the sky melting into hues of orange and violet. The world had always been loud, but in moments like this, she found meaning in its silence. She opened her journal, a simple black notebook she rarely showed anyone. Inside were notes not about missions, but about people. Names of those saved. Coordinates of places where decisions were made. Thoughts about the moral weight of distance and the paradox of peace achieved through violence. The last entry she had written, months earlier, simply read, "Precision is mercy." A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Laskin entered, holding 2 envelopes. "One's for you," he said, handing the first. "The other's mine. Retirement orders." She raised an eyebrow. "You're leaving?" He nodded. 30 years. "My knees don't bend like they used to, and my kids barely remember what I look like." He smirked faintly. "Figured it's time someone else takes the reins?" "And the other envelope?" Harper asked. "Reassignment," he said. "Yours. They want you to lead advanced sniper doctrine development at Quantico full-time." She stared at it for a long moment, then sighed. "You think I belong behind a desk?" Laskin smiled knowingly. "You don't belong behind anything. But you've got something they don't teach in manuals, judgment. And someone's got to pass that down." She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced at the horizon again, where the sun dipped below the waterline, the day bleeding into night. "Maybe," she said softly, "it's time to teach the next ones how to carry the weight right." Her move to Quantico was quiet, almost anonymous, just as she wanted. She arrived before dawn on her first day, walking through halls lined with photos of marksmen, most of them men, most of them long gone. Her name wasn't there, and she preferred it that way. Fame had never been her mission. Legacy, however, was another story. Her first lecture drew more attendees than expected: Marines, Navy, even Air Force special operators. She stood at the front of the room, hands clasped behind her back, her presence calm but commanding. "You're all here to learn how to make shots that change the outcome of missions," she began. "But before you do that, you need to understand what those shots change in you. She told them about the science barometric pressure, temperature gradients, the Coriolis effect. Then she told them about the silence afterward, about how the echo of a single round could live in your chest long after the mission ended. No dramatics, no embellishment. Just truth. People think long-range shooters are detached, she said, that we don't see faces, just targets. But the truth is, we see everything. We see the wind in their hair, the dust around their boots, the humanity we're about to erase. If you ever stop feeling that weight, you've already failed. The room was silent. She let it hang there, then added, and that's what ballistic ethics means. Not whether you can make the shot, but whether you should. When she finished, the applause was restrained but genuine. As the crowd filed out, Rees, now a certified sniper, stayed behind. "Ma'am," she said, "I used your words on deployment. We got everyone home. Thank you." Harper smiled faintly. "Don't thank me. Just keep paying attention." Months turned to a year. Harper's lectures became doctrine. Her methods shaped the next generation of shooters marksmen who prized judgment as much as accuracy. Her record-breaking shot remained classified, but the legend of her discipline became foundational to military culture. Occasionally, she'd receive handwritten notes from soldiers. She'd train short messages like, "Your lesson saved my team," or "I waited instead of firing." It was the right call. Each one she placed carefully into her journal. To her, they were medals that didn't shine, but they mattered more. Then, one crisp November morning, as she walked the range alone, she noticed a young trainee struggling with a jammed rifle. Harper knelt beside him, fixed the mechanism with a few practiced moves, and said, "Never force it. The weapon always tells you what's wrong. You just have to listen." The trainee blinked up at her. "You sound like you're talking about people." "Maybe I am," she said, smiling. As the student walked away, Laskin's words echoed in her memory. "You've got something they don't teach in manuals, judgment." She realized then that this was her true mission, not the shot at 3,247 meters. Not the medals, not the silence that followed, but the act of teaching others to think before they acted. To value precision as an act of mercy rather than dominance. That night, Harper cleaned her Barrett for what might be the last time. Each piece came apart easily under her touch. The barrel gleamed, the bolt clicked smooth, the smell of solvent sharp but comforting. She ran the cleaning cloth slowly through the bore, remembering the snow, the wind, the sound of the world, holding its breath before the shot that had changed her life. When she finished, she packed the rifle away, snapped the case closed, and sat in the quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, whispering like memory. She smiled faintly to herself, not from pride, but from peace. Somewhere beyond Quantico, another mission was already being planned. Another sniper was preparing somewhere to face the same impossible decisions. Harper didn't need to be there. She had already left her mark, not in the records, but in the hearts and minds of those she'd taught. And in that quiet, she finally understood the truest measure of legacy. Not how far a bullet travels, but how deeply its lessons reach.